Okay, here we are. All right. Hi. Hi, Bernard. Could you just introduce yourself simply? Thank you.
So my name is Bernard LeRoux. I live in Sweden and I work with dialogue connected to complex social conflicts and social issues, societal issues.
Great. And just by way of a sort of personal introduction, how are you politically socialized? I mean, what was the trigger for you to become politically interested?
I grew up in apartheid South Africa and was quite naive as a white young person growing up there. And it was during my years at university mainly that I became exposed to the truth of the South African situation. And I think it was very much out of a moral, but also at that time, religious, spiritual activity, or yeah, I was involved with the church at that time, and it was a combination of those things that led me to become politically active in the protest against the apartheid regime at the time, around 1985.
Right, great. So that's a great frame to be inquiring. So, just broadly speaking, what does the word politics mean to you?
In a broad sense, it's the way in which society organizes itself. But I think more commonly, I relate to politics as something belonging to the party structure and the way in which those who have been given political power in whichever way, but in this country through elections, attempt to govern the country and make decisions, but specifically about distribution of wealth.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And if you could indicate what kind of a system you think that politics is currently part of. So if we think about politics as, in a way, serving a particular system, how would you describe that system that we're currently serving?
It's a system that I think is designed and made to primarily serve a particular section of society. It says that it is democratic. It certainly, in my view, is not in the true sense. And what happens, what I think has happened in my experience is that those who have power have simply created a system that looks as if it's participatory, but in fact simply perpetuates the those who have power remaining there. And that's not a party political thing. It's also simply a class, a matter of class and those who have always had power.
So can you imagine then from that, just to extrapolate as much as you can you imagine what kind of a different system would give rise to a different kind of politics? I mean, where is it that you feel you'd like to push out towards that would get beyond that very narrow where that narrow group of agents that you described just there? How would you?
In the first place, I think if we would take democracy seriously, we would move in the direction that I believe society needs to go. And that means, I think, quite simply for me, that those people who are affected by decisions that are made by whichever body or whichever group are involved in the process of making that decision. And I don't mean superficially involved or cosmetically involved. I mean involved for real. And that, I think that is really what would make a big change. And that's not happening within the present system.
Great. So that's a really clear indication of a shift that could be made, far more participation, or even the beginnings of participation from all of the people. And that would be a new idea of what democracy is.
Right.
So can we go from there then to your specific work? So can you describe your work, maybe in relationship to some of the things you've just been saying?
Right. We find ourselves working very much within the system and attempting really to work with those issues where the conventional democratic methods are not succeeding. And that's often where tension has arisen or is arising, tension, resistance, conflict, and trying to understand what the reasons for the tension is and what the reasons are for the system's inability to resolve the issues. And then we have been working for around 10 years trying to find and develop methods that would help to increase participation, because that is the basis of our perception of why things are not working, and the inability to deal with really complex societal problems. So to find ways of involving more people and at the same time making it manageable so that one doesn't have a kind of a situation which you're trying to include people, but you're simply not able to take their voices into the process. So it's a kind of challenge on many different levels. Does that answer the question in some way? Your voice has gone.
Sorry, that was me.
There you go.
Yeah, I just muted myself. Could you give us a few more practical examples? Because it sounds to me as if before you were talking about the narrowness of the discourse and the area of agency, and you're trying to extend that to include more people, but at the same time you're struggling with the fact that they have to be brought back into a system that is still working. So yeah, can you give us some actual examples of the work you do, and then I can imagine, help me to imagine where your boundaries, the boundaries that you're crossing might be.
Okay, so there are two questions at the same time. I'll start with the examples. So a current example is within the welfare system. We're working in a municipality where conflict has arisen around the local authorities' way of providing care for people with mental disabilities in homes, and particularly from the parents of these adult people who are being taken care of. That's where the problem seemed to be. And when we started working with this issue, it appeared that the problem was much bigger and there were more people involved. And in particular, the local authority and its way of organizing itself and the way of structuring care and the way it didn't have a clear vision of what it was trying to achieve was actually at the root of the problem, and that there were leadership issues and that there were structural issues. And so in order to deal with that problem, it wouldn't help to just simply have a kind of mediation and a conversation between the dissatisfied parents of the people with disabilities, but rather to have a conversation about the whole system, and to see how one could improve in the end, or how one could create a better care for people with disabilities by transforming the system. So that's one example. I think of others. We've been working with situations where violence has occurred so it's very different. People have been shot and killed in neighborhoods. And the question was the question came from the authorities, because, as I said before, we're working within the authorities. Everything we've tried hasn't really succeeded, and therefore we need to try something else. And that was when we were involved. And we supported a dialogue there which included all the local people surrounding the place. It was a preschool where the shootings had happened, and broader, to speak about violence and children growing up in a violent situation and what could be done. And that was a novel thing for the local authority, who is used to kind of just engineering solutions after they'd done some kind of diagnostic process, which has clearly not worked. And so the community, together with the politicians, together with the civil servants, came up with a list of things that they've identified and agreed on were part of the problem, and then started working on ways of resolving these issues together, rather than one party making decisions. So those are just two examples of the kind of things we try to do.
So it sounds to me as if in each case you're moving beyond this sort of idea of a conflict as a binary thing between two parties, into a more systemic way of looking at an issue, which is always with multiple stakeholders.
It could be. But conflict is never simply, for me, a binary thing. I see it rather as a red flag or a signal that something in the system needs to change. The system is saying something needs to change. And so to get away from the idea, and that's probably the binary part, the idea that somebody's at fault and somebody has the right answer. So yes, when it's a simple problem, it can be between two people. That's how I started working with mediation. Sometimes it's like that. But usually when people are involved, and particularly as situations become more and more complex, or are more and more complex, it will naturally involve many more people and adjacent systems. So to try and resolve something by simplifying it is what we really try to get across. That simply does not and will not work. And even if it works in the short term, will not be sustainable.
Do you find that when you are doing this kind of work that the people that you're working with are also each of them on some sort of a journey with understanding that this is systemic work we're talking about, as opposed to and you know, I of course, if you're talking about in theory, that would sound like a theoretical question, but in fact, when we're talking about it from a politics point of view, it goes back to the thing you were saying at the beginning, which is, you know, moving into a different idea of democracy, for example, which stretches across the whole community.
Yes.
So that people start to feel responsible for what's happening in their community, as opposed to just pointing at a party or a political leader and saying it's your fault. Does that occur in your
I would say in very few cases, people understand the systemic nature of what we do, especially at the beginning, because there's both within the structure and outside of the structure, there's very much a kind of black and white rational way of looking at pretty much everything and even society. So somebody will be to blame, somebody will fix it, somebody's responsible, somebody needs to take responsibility. It's only when we start working with the issue, it's only when people come into the room and sit around a table that there's a chance of them realizing that we're doing something different and we're doing it in a different way. We don't really try to explain the kind of theory behind ever. Mainly suggest to people that, and that's all of the people involved, those in power and those who are not, but to explain to them that the only way we see out of the dilemma or the problem we've landed in is to find solutions together. And maybe not even solutions. Sometimes it's just to find a better way forward together, which might not be a solution that everybody likes, but something that we can all live with. So it's, to answer your question, no, not many. Society, at least in Sweden, is so used to a structure which is an us and them structure that it takes quite some time for people to actually realize that this is not about us and them. So yeah, and it's often only when we are in the process that people start realizing that this is something very different from what we are used to doing.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, so that seems like a shift. That would suggest a shift in our ideas of agency. You know, if it's not his fault or her fault or even my fault, but it's somehow shared between us. Would you say there are any other values that you can identify that might shift in that process as well, if you're thinking about it as a values system or a values space of any kind? What else do you feel needs to be sort of present in the room to allow that to happen, that shift that you're describing?
You will have to help me if I'm missing the idea of values, but
Mm.
for me, one of the central issues here is relationship and trust. Now, when you're in a situation where people are blaming each other and seeing the world as black and white, us and them, there's often very little space for relationship, and trust is often something that's lacking. So what happens during these processes inevitably, I would almost venture to say, is that relationship begins to develop, and then a sense of openness towards the other. And that might not involve trust always, but trust would probably be an added value that one could achieve. But at least uh, being honest and being able to understand where the other person or the other parties or the other people are coming from. So a recognition really that there's that recognition. There's another aspect for me that I think is also important, and it's a word that's kind of overused and possibly misunderstood, but empowerment, enabling people to say what they need to say, and enabling other people to take that seriously. So what you would call those, or whether those are the values you're asking about, that is really what inspires me to work with, or to do this kind of work, to work with dialogue. Because if that doesn't happen, you're not really succeeding in doing dialogue, in my view. And that's why I have some doubts about technology's ability to substitute real dialogue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you. You know, what kind of spaces can these dialogues occur in a meaningful way? I mean, what I'm imagining is that you are, to some extent, waiting for the call, you know, to be invited into a conflict of some kind. And therefore, you're responding to what's already appearing as a conflict. But how could we, or do you think about other kinds of spaces where your work could be pursued?
Okay. I risk misunderstanding the question, but let me just. Conflict is not necessarily as a point that you reach. So to say conflict has occurred, I would say that it's a line that starts somewhere with a mild sense of discomfort, that we're not really comfortable with the situation, right up to the point of violence or separation. And there's a lot in between. So in my view, tension is never a bad thing. It's simply, if there was no tension in society, it would probably be a very, very boring and not very dynamic place to find yourself in. The tension is what actually creates and spurs creativity. So if I try and answer that question by saying that if we do not wait until the conflict becomes destructive, damaging, but really start to see the signals of developing tension, and instead of trying to squash them by oppressive means or by, as they do in Sweden, by simply sweeping it under the carpet until it becomes a big thing, to work constructively with what we would call the no, to work constructively with criticism, to work constructively with discomfort, to work constructively with even a kind of unwillingness to participate, and to see that as a challenge for whichever system to transcend and to move to its next level of development. Well, that's very theoretical, but that's kind of how I think about it. So yes, I do. It doesn't have to involve conflict, in your face conflict. But I think without it's also, dialogue is also, real dialogue, it's also a way just to deal with the creative tension in any planning situation, in any social situation, any family, and even within yourself.
Yeah.
But I sound like a missionary.
No, 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 not at all. Not at all. It sounds like you're reclaiming, the purpose of community, really. The community is a place where we talk things through, it almost sounds very natural. But I want to come back to what you said about the dangers of the virtual realm and being online, and why this can't deliver the same conditions for dialogue that you've been describing. So let's think a bit about, say, for example, Facebook or Instagram is never seen as a place for dialogue, I suppose, but Twitter, it's not dialogue, of course, but it's definitely exchange of views. So from that extreme perspective, I can see that it would be difficult to create trust. But can you say a little bit about what you think about as the human condition, or what is it that you think a human being is when it's not capable, when we're not capable of having reasonable discussions online? Why do you think that is?
All right. So let me just say that I don't say that you cannot have dialogue online. So just to be clear about that. But certain mediums or media are not conducive at all to dialogue, and can actually be destructive. So I used to have a very strong aversion to any digital alternative to dialogue, but I've actually changed my mind. I've experienced, and yeah, I've just spent the morning with somebody who works with digital tools. But anyway, so what I really want to say is that any digital platform can only be used to enhance what I think of as a real meeting between people. And there's a real problem with a platform like Facebook, where the dialogue is asynchronous, where it doesn't happen at the same time. It's in written form, and not face-to-face in the way that we're speaking now. So there are real problems that arise because there's a lack, the quality of a face-to-face conversation is simply not there. The checks and balances, it's very easy for people to say things, to misinterpret, to purposefully or unintentionally, and for things to just move in many different directions at the same time. So for me, that's seldom a very constructive conversation. And I think it's only when I can say to you, you know, Indra, what do you mean when you say that? Or, you know, this is my view. What do you think? And we can have that kind of in real time exchange, that we open the possibility for dialogue. Now we are having a conversation right now. So that's the closest I think one would come by to using the internet as a vehicle towards you know, having a dialogue. But then I also want to say that having people sitting across the table from each other in the same room isn't a guarantee for dialogue either. So I think it's still very much an open question for me. It's like, what is there in technology that can enhance not only dialogue, but meaningful participation? And what is there that is simply useless? And what is there that is positively damaging? And I think we need to ask the same kind of questions about face-to-face meetings as well. So I don't want to simply discard the digital as useless. It's a tool, and we really need to understand it. And I think, you know, being the kind of age that I'm in, I didn't grow up with digital. It's really a challenge to say, give it a chance and see what it's able to do, and be open. Have that dialogue with the digital world or the people who represent it, and see what is possible.
So what was the tool you were discussing this morning that made you feel slightly more optimistic?
Well, let me say first, there was another, you know, I recently did a course with a group called Solia, based in Paris, which is about online facilitation, which I think was excellent. It's the kind of conversation we're having, and speaking about how you can facilitate online conversations. And I was really surprised. I did the course because I wanted to challenge my own views, my own kind of prejudices. And I was really very pleasantly surprised, positively surprised about how you can actually reach a certain level, a depth through online conversation. But it's in real time, and it's with people seeing each other and with a facilitator. So that's the one. The other, what we did this morning was we're looking at ways in which to kind of do something better than to try and gauge what's going on in society by scanning a lot of Facebook and Instagram texts and saying, now we know, now we... and these are people working with creating forums and channeling the conversation around an issue or issues into a particular forum where it's possible to do a number of things. The one is to connect people, to reach people who, for various different reasons, never arrive at public dialogues or never come to public dialogues, to make it possible for people to participate even when they feel threatened and unwilling to, unable to, and so on, to actually reach a much broader spectrum of people. But also as a kind of data that we as dialogue designers need to design a proper dialogue. So as a kind of stepping stone towards having those conversations that are meaningful with the right people about the right things. And I must admit that when we do, boots on the ground kind of inventory of what's out there, we don't always reach those people who don't participate in many of the things that kind of conventional society offers, who keep their doors closed and who, for various reasons. And so I think that there must be a way in which we can use kind of a digital world to make it possible for more people to at least begin to engage in issues that are important to them.
So
That was
that's
a long answer.
no, it's really interesting. And does that suggest then that when we think about the people who are excluded from the interesting developing discourse that we're describing, maybe within the community, but there are still people who are excluded from that, whether because they are excluding themselves or for other reasons, which we haven't really gone into yet, but that some sort of digital engagement might pull them in.
Yes, as long as we also understand the limitations of the digital tools we use, because the very use of a digital tool could also exclude a whole number of people who are not comfortable using the medium. So there's the possibility. And then I suppose a question that comes up for me is, do we need to respect, no, it's not really a question, it's a statement. We also need to respect people who choose not to engage. But if they choose not to engage, I think it's very important to also give them the opportunity to say why they choose not to engage. It becomes a bit fuzzy there, but if the very system that they are participating in is that which they are resisting, there's a very good reason why they're not participating. And I think to get that on the table is also important, is to say, we've created the structure, but the we who have created the structure don't have the trust of those people we want to involve. And then we need to look at other ways of doing it, and maybe look at other actors to try and involve in the political world we move in. Because maybe the trust is just, it's so eroded that we'll never, for some people, never ever get them to participate in anything that is arranged by the current power structures. And that's where I see civil society playing an enormously important role as co-actors in the political world. I have no real answers about how that would, or how that works, but I think that there's a growing openness towards other actors than government, various different levels, to provide neutral spaces where people can feel safe to participate. Yeah.
So that's fascinating, because when we started at the beginning, we talked about the narrow discourse and how we could open up the wider terrain as maybe a source of a new politics, but then how do we get there?
Mm.
And now you're mentioning the civil society actors who will play a very important role.
Mm.
And that in itself is already quite a shift with regards to politics itself, because it's really, it's almost as if you've walked out of the political space into a new one. And yet, I think what we've all experienced, and you've described very well when you're talking about the possibilities of whole community tension that could even lead to violence at one end of the scale, we do need to occupy this space in some way and bring that conversation that you're pointing at into what ends up being political decision making.
Yeah, I think one of the things that many people within and without outside of the system are realizing is that the we are talking about is not is much bigger than the kind of narrow confines of the political or the representative democratic system. And I think even people within the system are seeing that, just looking at it from 180 degrees simply will no longer provide us with sustainable answers to really big questions. We need to involve the 360 degrees with and move beyond our views of who we are. I would almost say that if society would be much better off if there was the possibility to create kind of neutral and safe spaces outside of any particular structure. And there are such places in the world. I mean, there's some organizations who do that. And that I think is a much clearer option for creating the kind of dialogue we need. Yeah.
And if this dialogue were to, let's imagine, ripple out across society in the many different ways that you're pointing at could be possible, can you imagine that directly affects policy making and decision making?
You mean that will it affect policy making and decision making as it's happening at the moment?
Or do we need new structures in order to do that?
You see, I think there are problems within the way in which the structures are or have organized themselves right now. So yes, we need different structures and different structures on different levels. So why I asked the question back was, on a very local level, on a village level, you might not have exactly those structures. You might have you might have different decision-making mechanisms. I think of Africa, where I come from. On a village level, decisions are made very differently from how they are made up in, local and central government. So yes, it would be possible. I think it is possible to stimulate a different way of thinking about making decisions, period. Even decisions within families, where there are also structures, where there are also power structures, how do we make decisions there? I think it's for me, it's a kind of paradigm shift from a kind of authoritarian hierarchical culture that we have accepted and lived with and under for hundreds of years, to a much more inclusive and power sharing, respectful culture, and that's on all levels. I would say for me the challenge has always been, can I apply the same principles in terms of making decisions, power, um, and so on, to myself and my own inner tensions as I would to a relationship that I'm in or that others are in, to groups, to organizations, to society. And I think that it even starts with us, the way we treat ourselves, the way we don't respect the minority voices within ourselves. The voice that says stay at home. You're not, you know, you don't have to go out and do what you think you have to do, which is a kind of inner conflict. And I mean, usually the rational part of us kind of just overrules other parts, whatever, just to be able to deal with that tension. And I think it's all the way up to society that we need to learn how to deal differently with tension and make use of it in a creative and positive way.
Mm.
So yes, my my very naive hope is that what we do on a small scale could change the field in some way.
So you've brought it all the way back down, if you like, to the possibility of, a single human being like yourself developing the self, and that making a difference in the way you engage with others. So I wonder if you could try and describe just a little bit more around that. What it is that you feel, what capacities do we need to be, to give it a political term, a more effective citizen, for example. How do we talk about that in human terms? Because, my experience is that people talk about citizenship, they just think about obligation. I've got to go and be a volunteer. That's basically what people are thinking. I've got to volunteer and do stuff for people. But how could you describe that in terms of our, maybe even give a personal story about how you just gave a very good one about how you might have to take care of yourself. But what about the ones that are outward going? How do you become, what are the capacities, or how could it be an attractive proposition, to become more engaged with others? What do you feel's at stake for people, but also what's on offer for people?
Yeah. Um, I think the world, a binary world, a world which is simply focused on the black and white, right and wrong, good and bad, is a world which creates an enormous amount of stress. And it's also what creates stress in ourselves when we judge ourselves for doing things badly or not as well as we should or whatever. It creates stress in relationships when people don't fulfill our expectations, and it's a kind of right and wrong. This is how it should be, and it creates stress in society. So, if you're asking me what's in it, I would say we would create a more peaceful existence, not only for ourselves, a less stressed existence, which for me almost automatically implies a more creative, more peaceful just being as an individual if I'm self-focused. But if I'm focused on community, it would create more creative and happy communities. I I don't want to say harmonious and peaceful, really. Yes, but as long as we understand that um, a creative and happy community can be one where there is a good amount of tension, a healthy amount of tension, but that we can deal with it. I think a lot of it, why I think this is important also for me as an individual, and why I am engaged. I've asked myself the question a lot. My father was a judge, was a lawyer and a judge. And he was one of the apartheid judges, killed people. I think my family would cringe if I say my father killed people for political reasons. He sentenced people to death. And not only that, he was a judge, even at home. It was black and white, right and wrong, good or bad, better, worse. And I think as I grew up, just that the resistance against that became stronger and stronger. And it was, I suppose, partly that and need to be approved and whatever, or need for approval. But in the end, a kind of rebellion saying, that is what I would like to fight out there, because that's not healthy for any child growing up. It's not healthy for society. It hasn't done South Africa any good. It hasn't done our family any good. And I suppose there's that personal thing behind it. But the irony is that often that which we fight is that which we risk becoming, or maybe we're fighting it because we have it inside ourselves. So, so for me, part of the dialogue with myself, but also my dialogue in my relationships and with my community, also have to do with being able to deal with those kind of inner contradictions. So I see a lot of value. I see a lot of value in terms of personal growth and development when we see ourselves mirrored in others, when we are able to live a more kind of honest and open life where we can be honest with ourselves and with others. Gosh, long story, but that's kind of that's why I do what I do, I think.
No, it's fascinating and almost vital, because that process of moving away from your parents, is the very journey that everyone has available. So there's always the reality that our parents were living at different times than us, and so we can point at what seemed acceptable more acceptable then, and that we're carrying that development personally into the future. But then maybe as a sort of almost as a closing then, what kind of future could you really imagine? And I'm going to invite you to think about the failures as well as the successes. How, it would be very tempting to at any point just, think, well, if everything went well, then it would be this wonderful. But also maybe draw on one or two of your failures and think it could go this way too. So let's think about the future with the insights that you have about what is still prevailing and what needs to come about.
Okay. I think, the future for me is it hangs in the balance. There's a real, I think there's a very, very real risk that we would, either in the short or the long term, particularly in the short term, move more towards authoritarianism, I experience a lot of fear and uncertainty around me in society, and there's a kind of almost primitive or instinctive reaction to that, and that is to want authority and to avoid taking responsibility and being part of the answer, rather get somebody else to solve it for me. And I think that's a particularly dangerous way to move. It's regressive, but I see it happening around us politically. I see it happening just socially. You know, the kind of reaction to the coronavirus at the moment. You know, everything from let's close down everything and climate change, and I mean there are so many things that are many problems that are facing us could be potentially catastrophic and encourages a kind of more authoritarian society. At the same time, I think that the world and the society in the world, the worldwide society, is also changing in terms of wanting another, or needing and wanting another paradigm. I often think about it as a kind of a masculine, feminine polarity, maybe. We've existed in a we've had such a long time of a masculine dominance, and I don't mean men and women here. I think they're more in the kind of the masculine way, the masculinity, rationality, and what we're seeing is another reality emerging, which is inclusive, which takes into account the collective wisdom of people, of groups, of in society, and I think, and is willing to listen, is willing to include, and willing to open up, and I think there is no way of stopping that. So that's my positive view on the future, and it's a way of enabling that to happen. And if I'm optimistic about the move towards more authoritarianism, I sometimes think about that as the kind of death throes of the old sort of rational masculine dominance, and rather kind of, you know, fearful holding on to things that made us feel safe in the past, because the new is so different. So maybe that's very abstract. So I really see that the work that we do, attempting to create another paradigm for decision making, for politics, for society, for community. And I hope it's not too presumptuous to say, but I somehow see that as part of the future, and the future that's unfolding, and I would very much like that to be the case. Yeah, that's pretty much my fantasy. And even catastrophe, and even, you know, whatever happens, climate-wise or virus-wise or economic crash-wise, whatever hits us, might just be the kind of blessing we really need, if it doesn't wipe us out, which I can't really say anything about. So yeah, it's partly probably cynical, pessimistic, but I am hopeful that there's no stopping the new from arising.
Great. I'm going to stop right there because it's such a nice ending.